Ma'am, I'm gonna place these on for everyone's safety. Please remain still.
I understand, officer. Thank you for cooperating, ma'am. I believe the misunderstanding. Oh, my sweet little ones, you're not alone anymore. I don't know where you've come from. We're going home together.
Mom, we're here now.
I knew you boys would come.
Are you all right?
I'm all right, sweetheart. Don't worry.
Let's get you home.
Ma'am, put the bag down. The command cut through the rain like a blade. Grace Johnson stopped beneath the flickering awning of a neighborhood grocery store in southwest Atlanta. Water dripped from the edge of her faded blue coat. One hand gripped a wooden crutch polished smooth by years of use. The other held a paper bag filled with bread, canned soup, and a small bundle of fabric she had purchased for a customer's dress. Two police officers stood several feet away. Their patrol car idled at the curb, red and blue lights pulsing across the wet pavement. The colors reflected in puddles like broken glass. Around them, shoppers slowed. A cashier watched through the front window. A young man near the bus stop lifted his phone and began recording. Grace glanced at the paper bag, then back at the officers. "I paid for these." Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped closer. "We received a report of a woman leaving the store with unpaid merchandise." Grace looked toward the entrance. "I have the receipt in my coat pocket. Keep your hands where I can see them." The words came quickly. Too quickly. Grace froze. Rain gathered in the silver curls beneath her knitted hat. Her left leg trembled beneath the weight of her body. Years earlier, a highway accident had damaged the bones and nerves so badly that doctors told her she might never walk again. She proved them wrong. But every cold morning reminded her of the price. Officer Sarah Collins stood beside Daniel, watching Grace carefully. "Ma'am, we just need to verify what happened." Grace nodded. "I understand." She slowly lowered the grocery bag onto the pavement. A loaf of bread pressed against the damp paper. The young man filming stepped closer. "She said she has a receipt." Daniel glanced toward him. "Stay back, sir." The crowd grew quieter. Grace looked through the store window. The cashier had disappeared from view. Maybe she was checking the register. Maybe she was calling the manager. Maybe she was simply afraid. Grace had seen fear make people silent before. She understood it better than most. Daniel studied her face. "Do you have identification?" "Yes." "Where?" "In my purse." Grace motioned toward the small handbag hanging from her shoulder. Slowly, she moved one hand toward the purse. Her crutch slipped slightly on the wet pavement. Sarah stepped forward instinctively. "I've got you." She steadied Grace by the elbow. Grace looked at her with immediate gratitude. "Thank you, sweetheart." The kindness in her voice surprised Sarah. Most people being questioned under flashing lights were frightened, angry, or defensive. Grace seemed concerned about everyone except herself. Daniel opened the grocery bag and examined the contents. "Where's the receipt?" "In my right coat pocket." Grace raised her hand slightly. "May I reach for it?" He hesitated, then nodded. Grace carefully pulled out a folded strip of paper. Before Daniel could take it, the store manager hurried through the automatic doors. His face looked pale. "Officer, wait." Everyone turned. The manager held up both hands. "There's been a mistake." Daniel frowned. "What mistake?" "She paid." The manager looked at Grace. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Johnson." He held up a second receipt. The cashier confused her with another customer wearing a similar coat. A murmur passed through the crowd. Daniel looked down at the receipt in Grace's hand. The date. The time. Every item matched. The situation should have ended there. But embarrassment often made pride dangerous. Daniel straightened. "We still need to confirm her identity." Sarah looked at him. "Daniel," the manager verified the purchase. "It's procedure." Grace said nothing. She simply stood beneath the rain, her thin shoulders trembling from cold and exhaustion. Then Daniel reached toward the handcuffs on his belt. The sound of metal clicking free was small, but everyone heard it. Sarah's expression changed. Grace looked down at the cuffs. Her face remained calm. Only her grip tightened around the crutch. "I've never taken anything that didn't belong to me," she whispered. At that exact moment, Two black SUVs turned sharply onto the street. Their tires sprayed water across the curb. Both vehicles stopped in front of the grocery store. The rear doors opened almost simultaneously. Two tall men stepped out. One wore a dark federal suit. The other carried an official badge clipped to his coat. They saw Grace, saw the handcuffs, and ran. Mom. 25 years earlier. Atlanta looked very different then. The neighborhood where Grace Johnson lived had never appeared on postcards or travel brochures. The streets were lined with aging brick apartments, faded storefronts, and telephone poles wrapped with decades of forgotten flyers. Paint peeled from front porches. Broken sidewalks collected rainwater after every storm. Most people drove through the neighborhood. Very few chose to stay. Grace did. Even before the accident that permanently damaged her left leg, life had never been easy. She worked as a seamstress in a tiny alteration shop 6 days a week, repairing jackets, hemming dresses, and sewing torn school uniforms for families who often couldn't afford to pay full price. At night, she accepted extra work from neighbors. Curtains, blankets, wedding dresses, anything that could help cover another month's rent. She never became wealthy, but she became something far more valuable, dependable. Every morning before sunrise, Grace unlocked the front door of her small house on Maple Street. The house wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, an old wooden porch that creaked whenever someone climbed the steps. The roof leaked whenever heavy rain arrived. The heating system worked only when it felt like cooperating. Still, it was home. Neighbors often found Grace sitting beside the front window, quietly sewing beneath the warm glow of a small table lamp. She greeted everyone who passed. Children walking to school, postal workers, elderly neighbors carrying groceries. No one left her porch without hearing, "Take care of yourself today." One cold November evening, everything changed. Grace had just finished closing her sewing shop when she heard a sound behind the church across the street. At first, she thought it was a stray cat. Then she heard it again. A baby crying. She hurried toward the sound as quickly as her injured leg allowed. Behind an old donation box sat a worn cardboard carton wrapped in a faded blanket. Inside, 2 newborn boys. Tiny, shivering, crying with the desperate voices of children who had been waiting far too long. Grace immediately dropped to one knee despite the sharp pain, shooting through her damaged leg. "Oh, babies." Her hands trembled as she carefully lifted the blanket. There was no note, no names, no explanation. Only 2 frightened infants holding each other for warmth. Grace looked around. The street was empty. Cold wind carried fallen leaves across the sidewalk. Whoever had left them was already gone. Within minutes, police officers and paramedics arrived. The babies were taken to a nearby hospital while child welfare workers began searching for relatives. Grace couldn't stop thinking about them. For days, she called the hospital, then the social worker. Again and again. Nearly 2 weeks later, a county caseworker sat across from Grace inside her tiny kitchen. "You understand what you're asking?" Grace nodded. "I do." The woman looked around the modest house. "You live alone?" "Yes." "You have a disability?" "Yes." "Your income is limited?" Grace smiled softly. "Yes." The caseworker sighed. "Raising one child is difficult. You're asking to adopt 2." Grace quietly folded her hands. "I know." The woman hesitated. "Why?" Grace looked toward the empty second bedroom. Sunlight filtered gently through worn curtains, illuminating faded blue walls she had painted herself years earlier. She smiled. "Because they deserve someone who stays." The room fell silent. Months of evaluations followed. Financial interviews, medical examinations, home inspections, background checks. Many people believed Grace wasn't the practical choice. She had too little money, too little space, too many physical limitations. But every social worker who met her noticed something impossible to measure. The house was small. The furniture was old. Yet every room overflowed with warmth. Finally, the judge signed the adoption papers. Grace held both boys in her arms as tears quietly filled her eyes. She named them Marcus and Michael. Not because the names sounded important, because they reminded her of strength. That evening, she carried the sleeping twins into their new home. The old porch creaked beneath her careful steps. The house remained just as small. The bills were still waiting on the kitchen table. Her legs still ached with every movement. Nothing about her circumstances had improved. Except one thing. For the first time in many years, Grace Johnson no longer walked into that little house alone. She walked in as a mother. The years passed quietly. There were no headlines celebrating Grace Johnson. No television cameras arrived to document the sacrifices hidden inside the little blue house on Maple Street. History often remembered extraordinary achievements. It rarely noticed ordinary people who quietly changed lives one day at a time. Grace never minded. She had never loved for recognition. She loved because two little boys depended on her. Every morning began before sunrise. The old alarm clock rang at 5:30, long before Marcus and Michael opened their eyes. Grace slowly sat up, waiting a few moments before placing weight on her injured leg. The familiar ache greeted her before her feet even touched the wooden floor. Some mornings the pain was sharp. Other mornings it was only a dull reminder of the accident that had changed her life years before. Either way, she got up. She always did. The small kitchen soon filled with the comforting smell of oatmeal and homemade biscuits. While breakfast cooked, Grace packed 2 school lunches using whatever she could afford that week. Some days it was turkey sandwiches. Other days peanut butter. She always slipped a handwritten note into each lunchbox. Be kind today. Help someone if you can. I love you. Marcus collected every note. Michael taped many of them inside his bedroom closet. Neither brother ever told Grace. They simply couldn't bear to throw them away. After walking the boys to school, Grace spent the day inside her tiny alteration shop. The old sewing machine had belonged to her mother. Its metal frame rattled every time she pressed the pedal. The windows overlooked a busy sidewalk where people hurried through life without noticing the woman quietly repairing torn jackets, wedding gowns, and school uniforms. Her hands worked with remarkable precision. Even when her leg throbbed beneath the table, her stitches remained perfect. Customers trusted her. Not because she was the fastest. Because she cared. One rainy afternoon, Marcus entered the shop carrying his backpack. He couldn't have been older than 10. Mom? Grace looked up from a wedding dress she was hemming. What is it, sweetheart? He hesitated. Our class is going on a science trip next week. Grace smiled. That sounds exciting. Marcus lowered his eyes. It costs $40. Silence settled between them. $40. It wasn't a fortune. But for Grace, it represented nearly an entire week's grocery budget. She reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. When do they need it? Friday. Grace smiled warmly. Then you'll be there Friday. Marcus nodded, trusting her completely. He never asked how. That evening, after putting both boys to bed, Grace quietly returned to her sewing machine. The small clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Then 1. Then 2. Her fingers continued guiding fabric beneath the needle while her injured leg stiffened from hours without rest. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, only the rhythmic sound of the sewing machine filled the little house. By sunrise, the extra order was finished. She earned exactly $42. The next morning, Marcus found an envelope inside his backpack. $40. Along with another handwritten note. Go discover something wonderful. Years later, he would still remember that note. Not because of the money. Because he eventually learned his mother had skipped buying herself new winter shoes that month to make the trip possible. She never mentioned it. Neither did he. As Marcus and Michael grew older, Grace's lessons remained remarkably simple. She never lectured about success. She never spoke about becoming rich. Instead, every evening at the dinner table, she repeated the same quiet reminders. Never look down on someone because they're struggling. The strongest people are usually the gentlest. And if life ever blesses you, make sure someone else is blessed because you are there. Those words became the foundation of 2 young lives. Marcus carried them into law school. Michael carried them into federal service. Grace never imagined where those paths would lead. She only hoped her boys would become good men. Years later, people would admire their achievements, their discipline, their integrity, their courage under pressure. Very few would understand where those qualities began. Not in a courtroom. Not at a federal academy. Not inside a university. They began in a tiny blue house, where a disabled black woman quietly taught two abandoned boys that love was never measured by what a person had, but by what they were willing to give. 25 years passed more quickly than Grace Johnson ever imagined. The tiny boys who had once fallen asleep in her arms now stood taller than she could reach. The little blue house on Maple Street looked much the same as it always had. The white paint on the porch had faded beneath years of Georgia sunshine. The old rocking chair still rested beside the front door, and the flower boxes Grace carefully watered every morning continued blooming with bright yellow daisies. Very little around the house had changed. Grace preferred it that way. She still woke before sunrise. She still unlocked her sewing shop every morning with the same worn brass key. She still greeted every neighbor by name. The only real difference was the silence. Marcus and Michael no longer raced down the hallway arguing over breakfast. No backpacks leaned against the front door. No muddy sneakers waited beside the porch steps. The house had become quieter, but it had never become empty. Every Sunday evening, without fail, Grace's telephone rang. Sometimes Marcus called first. Sometimes Michael did. Most weeks, they ended up on a three-way call that lasted far longer than any of them intended. "Mom," Marcus would say, "have you been resting?" Grace laughed every time. "I've rested enough to make 3 wedding dresses this week." Michael always groaned. "There she goes again. You work too hard." Grace smiled into the phone. "And you worry too much." The conversation always ended the same way. "I love you." "I love you too, Mom." Neither brother ever ended a call without saying those words. Not once in 25 years. Marcus Johnson had become one of Atlanta's youngest federal prosecutors. Known for his honesty rather than his ambition, he refused to chase publicity or television interviews. His colleagues often noticed something unusual. He treated every courtroom employee exactly the same. Judges, janitors, receptionists, security officers. Everyone received the same quiet respect. When new attorneys asked him why, Marcus simply smiled. "My mother taught me that every job deserves dignity." Across the state, Michael Johnson wore a federal badge. Years of discipline had transformed him into a respected federal agent trusted with some of the agency's most sensitive investigations. Despite the demanding work, he never missed Grace's birthday, never forgot Mother's Day, never allowed more than 2 weeks to pass without visiting the little blue house. One Saturday afternoon, both brothers arrived unexpectedly. Grace opened the front door, balancing carefully on her crutch. "What are you two doing here?" Michael grinned. "We brought lunch." Marcus lifted 2 grocery bags. "And enough food to last you a month." Grace crossed her arms. "I told you boys not to spend money on me." Marcus laughed softly. "You've been saying that for 25 years. And you've been ignoring me for 25 years. They all laughed together. Inside the kitchen, the familiar smell of homemade cornbread filled the room. The brothers noticed something immediately. The refrigerator made a loud rattling noise every few minutes. Michael frowned. "Mom, how long has it been doing that?" Grace shrugged. "Oh, only a few months." Marcus looked toward Michael. "A few months." Grace quickly changed the subject. "So, tell me about work." Michael wasn't fooled. After lunch, while Grace rested on the porch, the brothers quietly inspected the house. The roof leaked near the laundry room. The water heater barely functioned. The back steps had begun to rot. Marcus sighed. "She never tells us." Michael nodded. "Because she'd rather spend money helping someone else." Neither of them felt surprised. Grace had always lived that way. The following week, construction crews quietly arrived while Grace worked at her sewing shop. By the time she returned home that evening, the roof had been repaired. New railings surrounded the porch. A wheelchair-accessible ramp had replaced the uneven front steps. Inside, a new refrigerator quietly hummed in the kitchen. Grace stood speechless. Marcus handed her a small envelope. Inside was only one handwritten note. It read, "You spent 25 years building our future. Please let us spend a little time protecting yours." Tears filled Grace's eyes. She looked at both men standing before her. Not lawyers. Not federal agents. Not successful professionals. She saw only the two little boys wrapped inside a faded blanket behind a neighborhood church. The same boys she had once promised would never be alone again. She smiled through her tears. "I suppose I raised two stubborn sons." Michael laughed. "We learned from the best." Grace shook her head, laughing quietly. She still believed she had given them everything. She didn't yet realize the greatest gift they were about to return could never be measured by money. It would arrive on a rainy morning, when she needed them more than ever. Rain continued falling across Maple Street. Tiny drops struck the flashing police lights, turning the wet pavement into a sea of red and blue reflections. A growing crowd stood beneath umbrellas and storefront awnings, whispering as smartphones quietly recorded the scene unfolding outside the neighborhood grocery store. Grace Johnson stood perfectly still. Her wooden crutch rested against her shoulder, while the paper grocery bag remained on the sidewalk beside her. The loaf of bread inside had become damp from the rain. Officer Daniel Brooks held the handcuffs in one hand. His expression remained firm, though uncertainty had begun creeping into his eyes. Store manager Thomas Reed had already admitted the mistake. The cashier had confused Grace with another customer. The receipt matched every item. No merchandise was missing. Yet Daniel hesitated. Years of routine procedures told him to continue verifying the situation. Something else, something quieter, told him this elderly woman standing in the rain did not belong in handcuffs. Officer Sarah Collins looked toward him. "Daniel, I think we've got everything we need." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He glanced once more at Grace. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't demanding compensation. She wasn't accusing anyone. Instead, she noticed Sarah's jacket was soaked through. "You should zip your coat." Grace spoke gently. "You'll catch a cold standing out here." Sarah blinked in surprise. The words almost didn't register. Grace was the one trembling in the cold. Yet somehow, she was worrying about someone else. Sarah smiled faintly. "Thank you." Grace nodded. "My boys always forget their jackets too." A small laugh escaped Sarah before she caught herself. Daniel watched the exchange without speaking. The young man recording from the bus stop quietly lowered his phone. People around him exchanged puzzled looks. Nothing about Grace matched the frightened suspect described over the police radio. She looked more like someone's grandmother. Someone who baked pies for church dinners. Someone who remembered birthdays. Someone who probably knew every child in the neighborhood by name. Daniel slowly returned the handcuffs toward his duty belt. Then, the sound of powerful engines echoed down the street. Heads turned simultaneously. Two identical black SUVs approached through the rain. They weren't speeding recklessly, but they moved with unmistakable purpose. The vehicle stopped directly beside the patrol car. The engine shut off. For one brief moment, the street became completely silent. The rear doors opened. Two tall men stepped onto the wet pavement. One wore a perfectly tailored navy suit beneath a long black overcoat. The other wore a dark federal field jacket with an official credential clipped to his belt. Neither man noticed the crowd. Neither looked toward the patrol cars. Their eyes found only one person. Grace. Both men began running. "MOM." The word echoed across the quiet street. Grace looked up. For a split second, the years disappeared. She no longer saw accomplished professionals. She saw two little boys racing home after school. Her face softened into the same warm smile she had worn thousands of times before. "Marcus." "Michael." Marcus reached her first. Without hesitation, he gently wrapped his arms around her, careful not to disturb her injured leg. "You all right?" Grace smiled. "I'm fine, sweetheart." Michael quickly picked up the grocery bag from the wet sidewalk. His jaw tightened as he noticed the police lights. Then he looked toward the officers. "What happened?" Before anyone answered, Grace lightly touched his arm. "I'm all right. It was just a misunderstanding." Michael looked back at her. "Are you sure?" She nodded. Everyone's trying to do their job. Daniel felt an unexpected heaviness settle in his chest. Neither brother had raised their voices. Neither had accused anyone. Their first concern had been Grace. Only Grace. Sarah quietly whispered they called her mom. Daniel nodded slowly. I heard. Marcus carefully adjusted Grace's coat around her shoulders. You're freezing. Grace smiled. I've survived colder mornings. Michael removed his own jacket and gently placed it over hers. The crowd watched silently. Several people lowered their phones. The atmosphere had completely changed. This was no longer a police stop. It had become something deeply personal. Grace looked from one son to the other. I told you boys not to worry so much. Marcus laughed softly despite the tension. And we told you 25 years ago that we'd always come when you needed us. Neither Grace nor the officers yet realized exactly who Marcus and Michael were. But within the next few minutes, the truth would change everything. Rain continued falling softly over Maple Street. The flashing police lights no longer seemed as overwhelming as they had only moments earlier. Instead, the quiet street had become filled with something unexpected. Silence. Not the silence of fear. The silence that follows when everyone realizes they may have misunderstood someone. Grace Johnson stood between Marcus and Michael, her worn wooden crutch resting gently against her shoulder. Water dripped from the edge of her blue coat while Michael carefully adjusted his jacket around her to keep her warm. Marcus looked at her with concern. Mom, have you been standing out here long? Grace smiled gently. Oh, only a few minutes. Michael shook his head. A few minutes is too long in this weather. Grace reached up and straightened the collar of his jacket exactly as she had done when he was a little boy. You still forget to button your coat. Several people in the crowd smiled. For a brief moment, no one noticed the patrol cars anymore. They only saw a mother caring for her sons. Officer Sarah Collins quietly approached. Ma'am. Grace turned toward her. Yes. Sarah hesitated. I'm sorry you've had to go through this. Grace's eyes softened. Oh, sweetheart. Please don't carry that burden. Sarah looked surprised. Grace continued. You were respectful. You listened. That's more than many people remember to do. Sarah lowered her eyes. Thank you. Grace noticed the young officer's hands trembling slightly from the cold rain. You've been standing here a long time. Sarah smiled faintly. I suppose I have. Grace looked toward the grocery store. They make wonderful hot chocolate. You should get yourself one after your shift. Several people quietly laughed. Even Daniel Brooks couldn't hide a small smile. Grace somehow had the remarkable ability to make everyone around her feel seen. Marcus watched the exchange carefully. His mother had not changed. 25 years had passed. Pain had visited her. Loneliness had visited her. Financial hardship had visited her. Yet kindness had never left. Michael picked up the damp grocery bag. The bread soaked. Grace shrugged. It'll still make toast. Marcus smiled. You always find something good. Grace laughed softly. If you spend your life looking only for what's wrong, you'll miss all the reasons to be grateful. Those words settled over the street like the gentle rain itself. Several bystanders quietly stopped recording. An elderly man folded his umbrella and whispered to his wife, "That's a remarkable woman." She simply nodded. Officer Daniel Brooks finally stepped forward. His voice sounded different now. Less certain. More thoughtful. Miss Johnson, I owe you an apology. Grace looked at him kindly. You don't owe me anything. Daniel shook his head. I made assumptions before I knew the facts. I should have listened sooner. Grace studied his face. She didn't see a bad man. She saw someone learning a difficult lesson. She smiled gently. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after we recognize them. Daniel lowered his eyes. I'll remember that. Grace nodded. I hope so. Marcus quietly placed one hand on his mother's shoulder. He had argued difficult cases before federal judges. He had negotiated complex legal disputes. Yet nothing he had ever witnessed carried the quiet strength of this simple conversation. His mother wasn't trying to win. She was trying to heal. Captain Robert Hayes arrived moments later after hearing the updated radio call. He quickly reviewed the situation with Officer Sarah Collins. Then he walked toward Grace. "Miss Johnson, I've been informed there was a misunderstanding." Grace smiled warmly. "Everything seems all right now." Hayes looked briefly at Daniel, then back at Grace. "I'm very sorry for what you've experienced today." Grace answered with the same calm voice. "I appreciate you saying that." The captain nodded respectfully. Around them, the rain finally began to ease. Gray clouds slowly drifted apart. Soft afternoon sunlight broke through, warming the wet pavement with gentle golden light. Grace looked upward. "Looks like the storm's passing." Michael smiled. "It always does." Grace squeezed both of her son's hands. It usually helps when people choose kindness instead of pride. The crowd slowly began returning to their daily routines. The tension had faded. Only quiet understanding remained. If this moment touched your heart, remember that true strength is revealed not when life is easy, but when kindness remains even after being misunderstood. Share this story with someone who believes compassion has the power to change hearts, one conversation at a time. ****. The rain had almost stopped. Tiny drops still clung to the oak trees lining Maple Street, while the flashing patrol lights reflected softly across the wet pavement. The crowd that had gathered outside the grocery store remained unusually quiet. No one seemed eager to leave. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something far greater than a misunderstanding. Grace Johnson stood calmly between Marcus and Michael. Her weathered hands rested lightly against the wooden crutch she had carried for more than 2 decades. She looked at her sons with the same gentle smile she had worn since the day she first carried them into her tiny blue house. To her, they were still the frightened little boys she had found wrapped inside a faded blanket. Marcus slowly turned toward Officer Daniel Brooks. His voice remained calm. "Professional. My name is Marcus Johnson." He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored navy suit and carefully removed a leather credential wallet. Opening it slowly so everyone could see, he presented his federal identification. "I'm an assistant United States attorney." Daniel accepted the credential with both hands. His eyes widened. The seal. The photograph. The official identification. Everything was genuine. Before he could speak, Michael stepped beside his brother. He calmly removed another credential from beneath his federal field jacket. "Michael Johnson, Federal Special Agent." The quiet street seemed to freeze. Several people in the crowd exchanged stunned glances. The young man who had been recording lowered his phone completely. Officer Sarah Collins looked toward Captain Robert Hayes. Neither of them spoke. Hayes carefully examined both credentials before returning them. His expression immediately changed. He stood a little straighter. "Mr. Johnson, Agent Johnson, thank you for identifying yourselves." Marcus slipped the credential back into his pocket. "Our concern isn't our positions." He looked toward Grace. "Our concern is our mother." Daniel quietly lowered his head. For the first time that morning, he fully understood who Grace Johnson was. Not because of the successful men standing beside her, but because of the remarkable woman standing between them. Michael looked at Grace with concern. "Mom, did anyone hurt you?" Grace smiled gently. "No, they've all been respectful." Michael glanced briefly toward Daniel. His protective instincts were obvious, yet he remembered every lesson Grace had taught him. "Listen first, judge later." Marcus spoke again. "We understand mistakes happen." His voice remained steady. "But misunderstandings involving vulnerable members of our community deserve patience." Daniel nodded immediately. "They do. I should have shown more of it." Captain Hayes stepped forward. "I'll personally review today's incident." Marcus answered politely. "I appreciate that." Grace lightly touched Marcus's arm. "Sweetheart, that's enough." He looked down at her. She smiled. "I don't want a day remembered because people argued. I want it remembered because people learned." The words settled over everyone present. Even the bystanders felt the weight of them. Grace turned toward Daniel. "Officer Brooks." He looked up. "I hope tomorrow, the next person you stop receives the same chance to explain that you've given me today." Daniel swallowed hard. They will. I promise. Grace nodded. I believe you. Those simple words affected him more deeply than any criticism ever could. Sarah quietly stepped closer. Miss Johnson, may I ask you something? Grace smiled. Of course. How did you raise two men like this? Grace looked at Marcus and Michael. Her eyes sparkled beneath the fading rain. I loved them. She paused. And every day, I reminded them that strength isn't measured by how loudly you speak. It's measured by how gently you treat people when you have every reason not to. Neither brother spoke. They simply smiled. Because they had heard those words thousands of times growing up. Captain Hayes extended his hand toward Grace. It has been an honor meeting you. Grace accepted the handshake warmly. The honor belongs to all of us when we choose kindness. One by one, the crowd quietly applauded. No one had asked them to. It simply happened. Not because two federal officials had arrived. Not because police officers stood nearby. But because everyone had witnessed something increasingly rare. A woman who had every reason to become bitter. Choosing Grace instead. As the afternoon sun finally broke through the departing storm clouds, golden light spread across Maple Street. Marcus gently picked up his mother's grocery bag. Michael adjusted her coat once more. The three of them began walking home together. No cameras followed. No reporters asked questions. They didn't need recognition. The greatest victory that day wasn't that two accomplished sons had protected their mother. It was that the woman who had raised them proved once again that love is strongest when it teaches others how to lead with compassion instead of power. 3 weeks passed. The story that had begun on a rainy Atlanta sidewalk quietly spread throughout the community. The young man who had recorded the encounter never posted the first few tense moments online. Instead, he uploaded the ending. The video showed an elderly black woman smiling at the very officers who had mistakenly stopped her. It showed two successful sons embracing their mother instead of confronting anyone. And it showed something people rarely expected to witness: forgiveness. Within days, local churches, schools, and neighborhood organizations began sharing the video. Not because it contained conflict, because it contained hope. On a warm Saturday morning, the city of Atlanta hosted its annual community service recognition ceremony at a neighborhood civic center. Volunteers, teachers, firefighters, nurses, local business owners. Dozens of ordinary people gathered to celebrate those who quietly made their communities stronger. Grace Johnson had no idea why she had received an invitation. She almost didn't attend. I don't need awards, she told Marcus while buttoning her favorite blue cardigan. Marcus smiled. I know, but someone wants to thank you. Michael gently opened the passenger door of his SUV. And for once, you're going to let people do something nice for you. Grace laughed softly. You boys still think you're in charge. Marcus grinned. We learned from you. Inside the auditorium, nearly 300 people filled the seats. Warm afternoon sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating the wooden stage decorated with fresh flowers and American flags. Mayor Evelyn Brooks stepped to the podium. Good afternoon, everyone. Applause echoed throughout the room. She smiled warmly. Today we recognize people whose kindness has quietly changed lives. Several awards were presented. Teachers, paramedics, community volunteers. Then the mayor opened the final envelope. Our last recognition belongs to someone who reminded an entire city that compassion is stronger than anger. Grace looked around, assuming someone else had been chosen. The mayor smiled. Ms. Grace Johnson. The audience immediately stood. A long round of applause filled the auditorium. Grace looked completely overwhelmed. Oh my. Marcus gently squeezed her hand. Go ahead, Mom. Michael smiled proudly. They're waiting. Grace slowly made her way toward the stage with the help of her wooden crutch. Every step drew louder applause. Not because of pity, because of respect. The mayor welcomed her with a warm embrace. Miss Johnson, your kindness reminded all of us what leadership truly looks like. Grace smiled shyly. I only tried to do what my mother taught me. The mayor handed her a simple crystal plaque. Before returning to her seat, Grace was invited to say a few words. She looked out across the audience. Teachers, police officers, children, families, neighbors, people from every part of the city. She smiled. I'm not very good at speeches. The audience laughed gently. She continued. When I was young, my grandmother used to tell me something. Never let another person's worst moment decide your heart. The room became completely quiet. Grace looked toward the front row where Daniel Brooks and Sarah Collins sat beside Captain Robert Hayes. All three officers had come voluntarily. Not because anyone required them to, because they wanted to be there. Grace smiled at them. We all make mistakes. I certainly have. She paused. But forgiveness gives people room to become better. Daniel quietly lowered his eyes. He knew those words included him. Grace continued. If we answer every mistake with anger, the world only becomes heavier. But if we answer with kindness, someone might walk away different than they arrived. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. Marcus and Michael exchanged quiet smiles. Their mother hadn't changed. She never would. The audience rose into another standing ovation. Grace looked embarrassed by the attention. As she carefully returned to her seat, Daniel stepped forward. Miss Johnson. She looked up. He extended his hand. Thank you. Grace accepted it warmly. For what? She asked. Daniel smiled. For reminding me what this badge is really supposed to protect. Grace gently patted his hand. It protects people. Never forget that. Daniel nodded. I won't. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes forgiveness is not forgetting the past. It is choosing not to let the past decide the future. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who answer hurt with compassion, and in doing so, change hearts that once seemed impossible to reach. ***. 1 year later. Spring arrived quietly in Atlanta. The dogwood trees lining Maple Street had burst into white blossoms, their petals drifting gently through the afternoon breeze. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks after school. Neighbors sat on their porches waving to one another as the familiar sound of lawn mowers echoed through the neighborhood. The little blue house at the end of the street looked different now. The roof no longer leaked. The porch had been carefully restored. A sturdy wheelchair-accessible ramp curved gracefully toward the front door, surrounded by flower beds overflowing with yellow daisies and lavender. But one thing had never changed. Every morning, before anyone else seemed awake, Grace Johnson still unlocked her front door and swept the porch herself. She insisted on it. It reminds me to be grateful, she often said. On this particular Saturday, the smell of fresh cornbread drifted through the open kitchen window. Grace stood at the stove, humming an old gospel hymn while carefully stirring a pot of vegetable soup. Her wooden crutch rested against the counter within easy reach. She moved more slowly now. Her hair had grown whiter. The lines on her face had deepened. But her smile remained exactly the same. Outside, 2 black SUVs quietly pulled into the driveway. Marcus stepped out first, carrying a large paper bag from the neighborhood bakery. Michael followed behind him with fresh flowers tucked beneath one arm. Neither brother knocked. They never had. This house has always been yours, Grace used to tell them. You don't need permission to come home. Marcus pushed open the screen door. Something smells wonderful. Grace looked over her shoulder and laughed. You boys always know when lunch is almost ready. Michael hugged her carefully. You've been cooking all morning again. Grace smiled innocently. I might have. Marcus looked toward the dining table. It was already set for 3. You knew we were coming. Grace pretended to think. I had a feeling. Michael laughed. You always have a feeling. During lunch they talked about ordinary things. A neighbor's new puppy. A little girl from church who had just won a spelling competition. Marcus mentioned a difficult case he had recently completed. Michael shared a funny story about a new trainee who had accidentally locked himself out of his own office. Grace listened far more than she spoke. She always believed listening was one of love's greatest gifts. After the meal, Marcus quietly disappeared into the living room. A few moments later, he returned carrying an old cardboard box. Grace immediately recognized it. I haven't seen that in years. Michael smiled. We found it in the attic while replacing some insulation. Marcus carefully opened the box. Inside were dozens of folded pieces of paper. School drawings, handwritten notes, old report cards, birthday cards made with crayons. The little lunchbox messages Grace had slipped into their backpacks every morning. Marcus picked up one faded note. The edges had softened with age. He read it aloud. "Be kind today. Someone may need your smile more than you know." His voice trembled. "I carried this through law school." Michael reached into the box and unfolded another. "Strong people help others stand." He smiled through tears. "I kept this inside my academy locker." Grace covered her mouth. She had forgotten writing most of them. Marcus looked at her. "You spent years wondering whether you had given us enough." He gently took her hand. "You gave us everything." Michael nodded. "You didn't leave us money. You gave us character. You didn't give us power. You taught us compassion. And when the world finally trusted us with responsibility, we already knew how to use it." Tears slowly rolled down Grace's cheeks. She looked at the two men sitting beside her. Not the federal prosecutor. Not the federal agent. Only her boys. The same little boys she had once carried into this tiny house wrapped in an old blanket. As the afternoon sun settled lower in the sky, the three of them walked onto the porch together. Grace lowered herself carefully into the old wooden rocking chair. Marcus sat on one side, Michael on the other. No one spoke. The breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers across the yard. Somewhere nearby, children laughed. A church bell rang softly. In the distance, Grace reached for each son's hand. They held hers without saying a word. Sometimes silence carried more love than conversation ever could. The golden sunlight slowly faded across Maple Street. Three shadows stretched peacefully across the porch. A mother. Two sons. Not connected by blood, but bound forever by something far stronger. Because families are not always born. Sometimes they are chosen. The end.